There's a pretty one, Ulysses. There it is.
Hello BookTube, I'm Shawn the Book Maniac. Welcome back to my channel. Here I am with a review. This is a review of a novel from Wales, written in English. It's called 20,000 Saints, and the author is Fflur Dafydd. And it came out about almost 15 years ago. 2008 was the first publication. And I read it very recently and loved it. It was a 4-star read for me. I had a few problems with the way it ended, and I'm not going to discuss those except in the vaguest detail near the end of this review, but I want to sing its praises for the first 97.3% of this review. The first thing to say is that Fflur Dafydd had previously written only in Welsh, and I read or heard somewhere that she was hitting a brick wall writing this novel in Welsh, so she decided to write it in English, and I can't believe that English is not her first language. The thing that I loved the most about this book was the really sharp, incisive, gorgeous writing. This is a book that's set a little ways off the coast. I don't remember which coast, don't know much about the geography of Wales, but it's set on an island that does exist. It's Bardsey Island. I'll put up a couple pictures of Bardsey Island here. And what a rich cast of characters. Some might say that there were too many characters, but I thought she pulled that part off beautifully. The characters were incredibly well drawn. They were very distinct. They had really certain humorous characteristics. There was also a lot of serious themes that came out through the ways the characters interacted, but there was a lot of humor as well. Let me tell you about just a couple. I'm not going to name very many of them. In fact, I may only name my favorite character, Viv. Viv is maybe in her 60s. She is a hermit nun. I don't know if there is such a thing as a hermit nun, but I trust Fflur Dafydd not to lie to me about a thing like that. She had lived on the island for a couple decades or more, and then a certain crisis point in her life just a few years ago, she decided to become a hermit nun. But she's not very good at being a nun, and she kind of keeps slipping out of her role, and her interactions with the other quirky people on the island are not, I don't mean that she's breaking any vows, but she doesn't behave the way you expect a hermit nun to behave. I loved her with all my heart. And she's had a lot of tragedy, a lot of heavy stuff to deal with in her life. One of the other big things that's going on is that a documentary film crew has recently arrived. They have arrived before this book opens to make a documentary, and the main documentarian, what would be the word? I don't know, but the main person, she is sleeping with her assistant. Lots of steamy lesbian goings on in this book. It's a very queer book, I have to say, from the very opening paragraph, although I wouldn't classify it as primarily, well, an argument could be made that this is as much a lesbian novel as it is a Welsh novel. That thought didn't quite form in my mind until I was just talking to you here, but oh my goodness. So the young documentary filmmaker and her assistant, they are a hot item with poor communication, like most young people are when they're in a relationship with good sex, and you know, the other things have to kind of work out over time. And there is a man who is native to the island, or at least he's lived on the island as long as Viv has, and he's maybe 35 or 40, and he is heading up an archaeological dig. One of the fascinating legends about Bardsey Island is that 10,000 saints were buried there. And if you go and look online, you can find a little bit about that, but it is a thing, but it's basically a thing of legend. And this man, I'm not going to name the characters because it's easier to follow when you don't know the book. This man is supervising a kind of fly by the seat of your pants, not particularly professional or well organized volunteer excavation to try and find the bones of at least a couple of these 20,000 saints on the island. And so that adds a layer of history, just like the documentary filmmaking adds a layer of perspective in storytelling and what's included, what's left out. In the case of the documentary filmmaker, what is her agenda or her boss's agenda? What is she not revealing in the way she's choosing to shoot it or shape the narrative? All those things that you can't help but wonder, about those same dynamics in the construction of this novel. The island, Bardsey, is a main character in the novel as well, and you get a real vivid sense of it. And if you Google the references, you can actually look at the places that you're reading about. There's a cottage up on the hill at the base of the mountain. It's a real place that you can look at and so on, and I loved all that. One of the other characters is a young female poet who lives in Wales on the mainland, and she arrives in maybe chapter 2 to become the writer in residence on the island, and she has lots of issues, and she's young and sexy, and she's drawn to one of the characters, and so there's all those, and she's left a fiance back on the mainland that she's not sure she really wants to marry, and she's a very talented poet, but she has writer's block, and so all of these characters begin to enmesh themselves one with the other, and it makes for really engaging reading. I was just swept up by this novel. Many of the characters have secrets, and all I'm going to say. Most of the secrets come out. You can almost read it as a Shudder mystery, because there was a disappearance at least a decade or two before, and the consequences of that bleed into the present with some of the characters, because this woman had disappeared off the island, and some people think she was murdered, and others think maybe she committed suicide, and people that were very intimately connected to her are some of the main characters in the novel. And the documentary film crew is kind of in there like a dirty shirt with that subplot. So I think that's all I need to say about the plot. I'm going to spend most of the rest of this review just to read you a short section about my favorite character, Viv. And before I get to that, she lost me a bit at the end in the way that she pulled everything together and resolved a lot of those secrets. It didn't quite cohere with the characters that she had built, I didn't think. And so it was a little bit unsatisfying, and that dissatisfaction didn't come into it for me until about 20 pages before the end, and it by no means ruined the novel for me. It just knocked it down from a 5-star read to a 4-star read at the end. And the last thing I want to say about that, I would say that half of you, if you read this book, and I sure hope you will, you might have absolutely no problems with the ending and think that the ending was as powerful as everything else. And the other half of you might perhaps have more problems with the ending than I did. So it's a very subjective thing. What a talented writer. I believe there's one more book of her fiction that's available in English. None of her Welsh language writing has been translated, but I believe she's written one other novella or something in English that I'm going to be tracking down. She's also a very talented singer and musician, and if you Google her name, you won't find many references to her writing on YouTube, but you'll find all kinds of concert footage of her singing. Singer, songwriter, and novelist. I'm going to read you a short section near the beginning about Viv, this hermit nun who's not a very good hermit nun. She has kind of reluctantly attached herself to other hermit nuns on other Welsh islands and maybe some on the mainland, but she doesn't really like them, and they keep wanting to get her involved in their social activities, which seems counterintuitive that hermit nuns would have social activities, but they do, apparently, according to this book. But they kind of rope her into hosting a conference, and the word conference is overblown because it's just about 4 other hermit nuns come and stay at her house, and they have silent retreats or silent walkabouts or whatever. It's not really much of a conference, but she very reluctantly is about to host them. I think this passage happens as they're walking up the hill to her house from the boat that has brought them over to Bardsey Island. There is reference here to a farmer couple. The man's name is Howard and the woman's name is Mwynwen, although I couldn't find any help with pronunciation, but I think I'm pronouncing it right. Mwynwen. The reference to opportunity at the beginning is this opportunity to have a hermit nun conference on Bardsey Island, hosted by her. Most nuns would have loved the opportunity, she supposed. Her problem was that she wasn't really like most nuns. She'd been a lax, holy woman at the best of times, popping on the habit mainly when it suited her, namely when she'd been caught doing something she shouldn't have. When Wen, the farmer's wife, had come knocking the other week, she'd hoisted the habit about herself like armor, had stooped at the door, and had argued that God had insisted that she dig up all that rhubarb in Wen's garden, that it had been a call she couldn't ignore. Wen's face reminded her of the bold flashes of red in Rhubarb as it boiled. She'd had the most terrific crumble. It had been a few years now since she'd taken her temporary vows, and no one, not even the sharp-eyed Wen, had noticed her rather slipshod attitude towards her calling. but it was simply the way of things on Bardsey. She lacked comparison, context. On a 2-mile-long piece of land, you rarely had two of anything. Unless you were a chuff. And while she didn't question the mechanics of Winwen's home baking or Howard's lobster baiting, they were perfectly content to see her vocation as equally legitimate to theirs, fulfilling their need for spiritual service just by being there, even if she didn't always wear a habit, read her Bible, or wish to listen to their crises of faith during those long, mean winters. In short, there was no one to check up on her, no point of reference which singled her out as a fake. Not that she was a fraud, but she wanted to do it in her own way. She had always done things in her own way. As far as she could see, it was the only way, when you'd had a life as troublesome as hers. Many had viewed her decision of becoming a nun as another anarchical moment in her history, that perhaps moving to the island in the first place had not been extreme enough for her, and that becoming a nun was a means of finding a new level of extremity. But she knew it was nothing to do with being extreme. It was more to do with safeguarding herself, keeping people out. And although the emotion that had spurred her decision all those years ago had indeed been extreme, she was nothing now if not moderate, the quiet life of prayer having grown on her, like she'd grown into the habit. People left her alone now. They didn't ask her things. They didn't probe into what had happened to her, like they used to. People had believed they had a right, until she'd signed that right over to God. He now had the exclusive. Even tough-tongued Wen knew that there were certain things she couldn't ask anymore. If this sounds good, I urge you to pick up a copy. I don't know how easy it is to get. I had no trouble ordering it online last year. It's still in print as far as I'm aware, and it's a really good novel. And if you do read it, let me know what you think of it, and also whether you had problems with the ending or am I out to lunch. I kind of hope I'm out to lunch, because otherwise this was a masterful, really impressive debut of a novel about not just Wales, but an island in Wales, and all the quirkiness of that was so vividly brought out. Please try it. Thanks for watching.